Okay, I'm gonna start formally recording. Hello and welcome to join, taking time on this lovely summer evening to talk about the Massachusetts State Legislature, everybody's favorite topic. I know many of you already. If I don't know you already, my name is Jonathan Cohn, and I'm the policy director here at Progressive Mass. I'm in a second, I'll screen share with the kind of a slide deck I have and go over what's in the kind of what's going to be kind of the structure of the presentation, as well as then kind of notes about some actions to take, Q&A, etc. So let me get that set up to the beginning of the slide deck. You can continue to drop stuff into the chat. Okay. Okay. So let me move this. Let's view. I should use this more often. Okay. Okay. Let me go back to my first slide. So, as noted in the framing of this event, what we will focus on is what happened in the past legislative session, some of the things that didn't, some of the things that you can do now, possibly some discussion of what you could do in the future down the road to change things. And kind of just a little bit about structure. Before diving into things, want to establish kind of basic terminology. One thing that I often think of in a lot of policy spaces is how much jargon gets thrown around constantly. And I don't want anybody to like wonder what is actually being said with some terms. So we'll start with that. Highlight some statistics that show what I think was noted. I remember seeing Elaine comment in the chat of a kind of trajectory over recent years in the legislature. I'll highlight a little bit about what happened in the first year of the legislative session of last year, the few things that became law in 2024, things that are stuck in what's called a conference committee but could come out, at least one of two possible actions that will happen, some other updates, then Q&A. That's to start with, just to kind of establish some general kind of baselines. Does anybody know when the current legislative session started? You can drop it in the chat. I can call on somebody if anybody feels like raising their hand. Kelly.
Was it January? Like, I don't know, mid-January?
January of last year?
Yeah, January of 2024.
No, it didn't start January 2024. January 2023.
Oh, right.
So January is correct, and I have the exact date in my next slide. But January is correct. And when does the current legislative session finish? You've probably seen in the news that the quote unquote formal legislative session is over. But when is the last? Does anybody know the last date of the current legislative session and once the next one begins? That's on my next slide as well. And does it, can anybody give a definition of like what is familiarity with the terms of what a formal legislative session refers to versus an informal legislative session? You can drop it in the chat. I'll see stuff in the chat. I see yes to January 2025 for people over there. To go over this quickly, feel free to chime in with any of those questions before I go to my next slide. Okay. So the current legislative session began January 4th of 2023. The legislative sessions in Massachusetts, they run from the first Wednesday in January after January 1st. It is a smart thing that they never try to start the legislative session on January 1st. That would probably not go well. So that's why next year, when January 1st is a Wednesday, when January 1st would be that first day of the legislative session, it starts January 8th instead. So the current legislative session runs from January 4th last year, January 7th next year. What recently wrapped up on July 31st, which got a lot of attention in the news, is what's called a formal legislative session. That's the period of our 2-year legislative session when legislators come into the State House to take recorded votes. That's often also used to refer to the specific days when they come into the session. And what that means is that by the typical legislative practice, they don't intend to come back between now and then next January by their standard practice to vote on anything. It's a nice long vacation. There's other work that will be that they do, but they do not expect to take votes. An informal legislative session refers to then the periods when they don't take votes, or that things can only pass. And then when they're not coming in to take votes, that means that bills can still be passed and become law, but they can only do so by what's called unanimous consent. So that if a single person opposes it, you need to bring everybody in to prove that you have enough votes to outvote that person. So you can't do it, you can't have one person in the room passing bills because nobody there cares enough to say no. And that's the term kind of unanimous consent, of that meaning no one is present to object. If you've watched the live feed of the legislature, it'll go akin to like if I were seeking to get formal approval to go to the next slide in this, I'd be all those in favor say aye, all those opposed say no, then the ayes have it, the motion is adopted, and we're on to the next slide at that speed. In terms of the process. And so if they actually want to do meaningful work, it does require them to come back into session. And we'll talk about that again in a bit. So what passed into law in 2023 and 2024? So as of this weekend, when I was putting this together, Massachusetts had 253 laws signed in 2023 and 2024. That number might sound like a lot at the start. 192 of the 253 were home rule petitions. That means that there were about one city or town, possibly one town changing a board of selectmen to a select board, or a city or town trying to extend a police officer's ability to like be a police officer past a designated retirement age. So mostly pretty anodyne, small bore things. 34 of them were sick leave banks, which are when people kind of use up sick leave and are able to borrow from others, kind of retirement credits, or similar things about literally just one human being. 8 of them were budgets or supplemental budgets, things that the legislature needs to pass for the state to run. And that leaves only 19 other pieces of legislation signed into law, which yields effectively 1 per month of the January to July session. Those range from things that are on the scale of the like not very good tax bill from last year, or the recent housing bill, to things of a much smaller basis that are really technical fixes, or I know one of them was like a mitochondrial disease awareness day. So they range of that 19 and how significant or whatever minor they are. So that's basically meaning that less than 10% of them were actually like individual laws, not about one person or one town or something that they need to do by law. We've also seen in recent years the number of recorded votes, both in the House and the Senate, fall. So something about it, again, kind of showing recent statistics. You can see back in 2005 to 2006, when there were, I don't know why they got up to 915. You can see most of the years since have been in like a 400 to 600 type range. And the House, this session, has taken 199 recorded votes. Some of them just being things that they legally have to vote on anyway. We've seen, and it'll be less fancy of a graphic, the same trend in the Senate, with less precipitous of a decline. But you can see back in 2005 to 2006, them back at 671, and that falling over time to the point where this session and last only around 250 votes that they take during the entire session. That means that many of the things that they pass either don't get actually deliberated in public view, or they don't pass at all. and they aren't taking votes. This is a little bit out of date. This slide's a little bit out of date, but it's a nicer graphic representation. And I'll have the updated numbers, but you can see that the number of bills that became law has also fallen over the past decade and a half. This is a few days old, and you can see by my 253 earlier, but the trend, this downward trend still holds. And it's frankly, even though some of those, as you saw before, there's a certain degree of bloat in what gets passed, even if they're simply doing fewer of those, it shows that the legislative process is increasingly getting slowed down and becoming increasingly ineffective. You can see that's again with updated as of this weekend, where kind of a decade and a half ago, you had around 500 things becoming law by this date, and we have only half of that. So again, if you felt that this legislative session has been slow and unproductive, you are not wrong, is what those numbers are designed to show you, that sometimes vibes are reflections of reality in terms of what's happening. So before I go on, any quick questions? I just want to see if there are any quick questions. Feel free to chime in quick questions before I start going to the next section of this.
Yes, I have a question.
Yes.
In the unanimous consent, are the subjects posted? So if you object, you can run down to the State House?
Yes. So it would be for objecting, like any rep can show up and object. One thing that has happened in recent session, like that we have seen in recent session or a few sessions ago, where when legislators opposed something that was going to be taken up, they just made sure that somebody was in the room. So that if somebody was in the room to oppose it, it wouldn't happen. And so that means that effectively that means if you want to block something, you can block it with one person. It means if you want something to pass, it can't pass if there's even one person opposing it, so that you would need to come in.
And how much time do they have? When are the things that will be voted on posted? I mean, is there clear opportunity to know what you would want to run down there for?
That I don't know. That typically they get a schedule for the week, the Friday for the next week, but I don't know how much that's actually abided by.
Okay, thanks.
No worries. I'll take the quick questions from Zaida and Margaret, and then I'll move on to the next slide.
Who were the speakers and Senate presidents back in the day when there were so many votes taken? Were they heroes, or were they also not such great guys?
I wouldn't say it's inherently a reflection of the comparative progressivism, but it's more of the willingness to allow things to be debated, I think, is the trend that we've seen, where the legislature, and we've seen comments by this from former state legislators who've served across the time, where the willingness of the Senate president and the Speaker of the House to allow for dissent and to allow for debate has fallen to the point where there was a great recent piece in Commonwealth, I can send it in a follow-up, about how whenever legislators file amendments to bills, they typically withdraw every single one of them before the final vote happens. And so what that means is where in past sessions, you might have people taking votes on whether they were Democratic amendments or Republican amendments, or just having any debate on those. Increasingly, they're all just being withdrawn, or they're being withdrawn, so you aren't actually getting meaningful debate. And see, Zaida, see a question.
Yeah, just a quick question. Does the bills that passed, does that include the Parentage Act that was signed into law today?
Yes, so that's a good question. My stats for, I have that in a slide on the slide deck for the 253 that probably would make it 254, because that I believe was signed today, so that'll go up by 1. And if there are any home rule petitions signed, because putting this together, I basically timestamped it for August 11th. So it will go up.
No worries.
Yep.
I just, if we're going to call them out, let's give them the credit of that one more bill.
Yeah, so it's one bill, although what I had done specifically so I could calibrate it, all of these reflect timestamped the same date across legislative sessions, so that we don't show, knowing that some things like home rule petitions might become law between now
Sure.
and the end of the year. Time-stamped it as where were they now to show how much where they are by now has fallen.
Yep,
That's the
yep.
question.
Late homework doesn't count. Late homework doesn't count.
Exactly.
Thank you.
No problem. And it's going to go into the next slide. Just as a refresher, most of my slides are going to be talking about 2024, but as a reminder, 2023 included the first year of new investments from fair share revenue. As a quick, you can raise your hand, you can physically or through an emoji. Who here did any work for question 1, the fair share amendment back in 2022? Whether you knocked on doors or called voters or tabled or anything else. Okay, love to see it. So you can take credit for all of those things that the legislature did back in 2023, and I'll show again for 2024. I like to give credit where credit's due, and that is the work that we collectively did to secure that money, rather than the suddenly like high-mindedness of the legislature itself. Some of the things that were important victories, some calendar year 2023, include joining states like Minnesota and having free universal school meals. That was something that last year, I think starting with the kind of Minnesota Democratic trifecta doing this, a number of other states adopted, and something that that the legislature did by using fair share funding, something that is both good policy and good politics. Making sure we've been seeing on the national level in recent days, more discussion of that, which is great to see. That it's wild how children should be fed is not a universally held position in this country, with certain political parties opposing it. That last year also saw the legislature pass in-state tuition for all high school graduates, regardless of immigration status, something that was great to finally see. Although other states, including states like Texas, had actually done that much before us. One thing where we weren't the first to do it, but we passed something much more in advance of other states, was guaranteeing free calls in prisons and jails so that incarcerated individuals can stay connected with their families outside. The bill that was signed into law in 2023 was actually much stronger than other states before it had done so, by making sure that county jails were also covered. And also, on a less positive note, in 2023 was when the legislature passed a fairly regressive tax bill. I'm not going to do a deep dive into the tax bill because I've talked about that many a time, and we've emailed you about that before, and it could be it's an event of its own. But wanted to make sure to note that as a less good part of 2023. But okay. Also just highlighting the impact of things. One, what you can see in this great chart made by the folks at Prisoners Legal Services is that no cost calls has had a real tangible impact. You can see the increase in call volume that occurred in December and January after that was signed into law, and then cost was no longer a burden, so that people wouldn't have to be choosing between food and rent or utilities and be able to stay connected with loved ones. Okay. If you've thought that the legislative session was slow moving, again, you are correct. 2 of the bills that did pass recently had a very slow journey to passage, which I wanted to highlight before talking about the bills themselves. We saw this with the gun safety bill that recently got signed into law, as well as the pay range disclosure bill that got signed into law. You can see how with the gun safety bill, the House voted on it in October. It took 3.5 months for the Senate to vote on a bill in February, and then it took 5.5 months for the House and Senate to finally agree on legislation in the middle of July, only doing so because of the July 31st deadline. The same dynamic happened with pay range disclosure legislation. There was not much of a gap between the House and the Senate. This time, they both took action in October, but then they didn't come to an agreement until 9 months later, 1 week before the end of the session. So again, if you thought that things are moving at a snail's pace, they were. And when the legislature sucks up so much time negotiating what can be fairly small, although not insignificant differences, they suck up legislative space from other work that they also didn't do. To go on to quickly highlight what those were of things that passed. Shout out to anybody here active with the Massachusetts Coalition to Prevent Gun Violence, or groups like Every Town and Moms Demand Action that have done a lot of work around gun safety legislation. Massachusetts has a kind of typically either among the strongest or the strongest laws in the country, and the legislation recently signed into law continues that. Raised the age for owning a semi-automatic rifle to 21, expanded the state's red flag law, which is when people think that somebody would be a threat to themselves or others, if they had a gun, are able to petition the court to make sure that they don't. That it required the development of a new training curriculum and standardized test for getting a license. Put strict penalties for possession of machine gun conversion devices. And updated our state's assault weapons ban, kind of cracked down on what are called ghost guns, which are those kind of 3D printed guns where people are able to assemble them at home, which creates a dangerous loophole to kind of existing gun laws. Prohibited the possession of firearms in schools, polling location, and government buildings, something that should be basic common sense. And strengthened data collection around gun violence so that we can better take action going forward. Okay. One of the other things that I noted that had its long journey to passage, but finally passed, was kind of a pay range transparency bill. The final bill was named after former Secretary of Labor Frances Perkins, that requires employers with more than 25 workers to include wage or salary range for positions in job postings, as well as to share the pay range whenever an employee is getting promoted. It's something that's been shown to be important to combat gender and racial disparities in the workplace. The Wage Equity Now Coalition, I'll give a shout out to them, have done a lot of advocacy around this. Also noting, you can see here that it requires greater data collection, because if we want to correct inequalities, we need to know that they exist, and data collection is critical. This work around pay range transparency as an issue has been going on since like 2019, when Colorado became the first state to pass such legislation. You can see here, it's a little bit out of date of a sheet of a graphic because it was from 2023. But Massachusetts joined states like Washington, Nevada, California, Colorado, New York, Maryland, Connecticut. In doing so, we'd be great if we're first. Doesn't always happen. Something that I know Zaida had mentioned before, the Parentage Act, which was signed into law today, which updates Massachusetts' 40-year-old parentage statutes to be more inclusive of LGBTQ families, as well as families formed through assisted reproduction, making sure that parentage laws kind of acknowledge that not all parents are necessarily just biologically connected, and that we need to make sure that they have kind of those bonds need to be strengthened under legal basis as well, so people don't have to go through hoops to adopt their own children. Massachusetts was the last state in New England to update parentage laws. What this always, to me, was a great example of is Massachusetts was kind of a leader among states in creating marriage equality, but then a laggard in a number of other states when it came to actually updating other laws. So that it's what we need as a state to do is to be first and to keep being first, not being first and having to then kind of take forever to actually finish our early achievements. But yeah, as noted, that finally got signed into law today. So one thing that got a lot of attention during this legislative session has also been the Affordable Homes Act. That's often referred to as the Housing Bond Bill. During the discussion, whoops, that did not, let me reshare that. Trying to get, okay. It is described in the press and by legislators as a $5.2 billion kind of bond authorization. But what's important to recognize is that most of that money will not be spent. Because it is not a $5.2 billion appropriation of funds, as it would be, let's say, if it were part of a budget. A bond bill, and I'll give a shout out because I think she's on this call, friend Vicky DiLorenzo, who's now at Mass Budget, who gave me the metaphor for it of being a menu. That a bond bill is effectively a menu. It's not your final order, but it sets the parameters of what you can use money for. And so what that means is, particularly as the governor has said herself in a capital expenditure plan, that she plans to invest about $2 billion in these capital expenditures So it's only going to be about $2 billion of the 5 that actually get spent. There are many good uses of that, including more money going to public housing, important funding going to decarbonization, but there will be work that needs to get done to make sure that money actually gets spent. One thing that was often a problem under Governor Charlie Baker is that the legislature would pass a large bond bill and everybody would give themselves a pat on the back for passing it, and then Charlie Baker wouldn't spend any of it. That Healy is likely to want to spend more of it, but it's not a done deal. There were some important policy components. I'll talk about those that got in and those that were unfortunately left out. Among the policy components of what finally passed include legalizing accessory dwelling units by right. I have a slide on that in 1 second. Creating a process for the sealing of eviction records. Again, I have a slide on that momentarily. Creating a pilot program around foreclosure mediation. I believe Carolyn Shu is on this call from Homes for All, and I want to give Carolyn and Homes for All a shout out for the work on foreclosure mediation, which would bring together somebody who's at risk of foreclosure as well as the lender, so that they have to be in the same room together and possibly find out alternative solutions so that somebody can stay in their house. The bill also creates an Office of Fair Housing to combat housing discrimination, and also has steps to streamline the use of state land for housing, which it can help to make sure that we have possibly more opportunities for affordable housing when the state owns the land. Just quickly, to explain some of those terms, I've often, in past following things, I've often found discussions of accessory dwelling units to be overly wonky because it's a kind of a term of art in the housing space. That those are those kind of small, independent kind of housing units built on the same lot as a single family home. That there are some examples in photos. That's an easy way to increase housing stock and also help people to afford their homes, whether they're choosing to live in the main place or if they want to downsize to a smaller unit on their property and then sell or rent out the other space that they have. The housing bond bill would allow for this in single family zoning districts across the state, making it easier to kind of have those increases in density and helping people to possibly age in place, and also preventing some of the tactics that have historically been used to make these more difficult to build, whether those are owner occupancy requirements or parking mandates. So it's a good step. We'll have to see what the numbers work out over the few years, but it helps combat a kind of NIMBYism that has prevented them from kind of yielding fruit or even being passed in the first place. With eviction sealing, eviction records in Massachusetts are created as soon as a case is filed and are publicly available forever, regardless of the outcome. Fortunately, the legislation passed kind of as part of the Affordable Homes Act changes that and makes it so that people have the ability to seal eviction records. It gives people the ability to petition a court to seal an eviction record if their case was dismissed, or if it was what's called a no-fault eviction, they can petition the court immediately, and after like a 1-week waiting period, their record is sealed, and it can also then never be used in a credit report against them. The bill creates a longer timeline for people who have kind of evictions due to not paying rent or fault evictions, being 4 years and 7 years, but still creates a process where it's not like a kind of like a scarlet letter, so to speak, that kind of harms people's record permanently and makes it more difficult for people to obtain housing. However, not everything that we wanted to and fought for, including in the bill, was able to get in. I know many of you were very active, asked me in the organization were, through you, on fighting for ways to expand this bill, whether that's a local option real estate transfer fee, which I apologize for my misplaced apostrophe on the governor's bill, as well as a number of home rule petitions around the state, from Boston to the islands. Cities and towns wanted to be able to raise money for affordable housing, and the legislature chose not to allow them to. The House had included language on what's called tenant opportunity to purchase that would allow tenants to band together when the owner is selling their building so that they can purchase it themselves. The Senate had included language to ban the passing of brokers' fees onto renters, so that you wouldn't pay like so much extra money as like a flat fee when trying to get a new apartment. That didn't get into the final bill. The governor's bill and the Senate bill also included language about what's called inclusionary development, where cities and towns require a certain percentage of new housing units be affordable. That they would have allowed cities and towns to pass those ordinances by simple majority. That didn't get into a final bill. Also left out of the discussion entirely by legislators, but not by advocates, was something with things like rent control, which we know that if we want to be able to prevent people from being displaced, we need to stabilize rents so they don't get pushed out from neighborhood to neighborhood and then out of a city and then out of the state. So what this means is that I know that you'll hear from us soon. The next session gears up, is that there's a lot of work still to do. The legislators get you can give them a partial win on the good things that came out of this bill, but any claims this being a generational win for housing are grossly overstating what they did, and there is more work to do, and they shouldn't be allowed to not do it. Also, in terms of quickly noting that all housing policy is not good housing policy. In terms of one of the bad things, most of my slide is highlighting good things that are done. But it's been unfortunate to see the legislature and Governor Healy roll back our state's right to shelter. When earlier back in the spring, that the legislature voted and Healy signed legislation to limit family stays in emergency assistance shelters. That's gotten even stricter with time. We'll touch on that kind of later. But just highlighting not everything that the legislature does is good, despite our overwhelming Democratic majorities. Going back to before, when I was highlighting what everybody here was able to win for the state in terms of the Fair Share Amendment and the investments that have come from it, I just wanted to highlight in tangible terms what that has meant this current year for the upcoming fiscal year. That means over $500 million in new investments in transportation, in things like roads and bridges, in public transportation, in capital investments. I'll give a special shout out to being able to extend the kind of fare free services and regional transit authorities, which have been popular and well used wherever they've been implemented. It also has meant about $250 million in additional investments in K-12 public education, the continuation of universal free school meals that I had mentioned before, as well as increasing minimum aid funding for local schools, funding for early literacy, funding for clean energy infrastructure in schools, and for mental and behavioral health, kind of in other programs. And again, that is money that you helped win for the state. Also for higher education, and again, a little under $250 million that included tuition-free community college, increased financial aid, money for wraparound services, and additional investments for public colleges. That additional money from Fair Share was also able to help go to early education and childcare. And at the start of the legislative session, Governor Healy said she wanted to take action on this issue, and Speaker Ron Mariano said he wanted to, and Senator President Karen Spilka said she wanted to, and it took them forever to do so, but they did finally put significant more new investments in childcare and early education, again, won by the Fair Share campaign that everybody here worked on. And they were able to deliver on key parts of the Common Start Coalition's framework of greater stability for childcare providers by making a grant program and for operational kind of funding for childcare providers permanent, by increasing supports for early educators, like loan forgiveness and scholarship programs, and a career ladder with salary and benefit guidelines, as well as increased affordability for families. This work will continue because they need to make sure that they're continuing to provide funding for all the promises that they make, as well as, given that we have the most expensive childcare in the country, there's still continual work that needs to happen to make that just be even beyond just the expansion promised. Also, a few things that are good to highlight from the recent fiscal year 2025 budget were an access to counsel pilot program to provide legal representation for low-income tenants, increase the cash assistance for families, seniors, and people with disabilities in deep poverty, and continued work to replace their state flag and seal, which is a horribly racist state flag and seal that should have been changed live. Okay, however, in terms of things that should have happened but didn't, because although it feels nice to occasionally say good things about the legislature, not everything that they do is good, whether by omission or commission. They left out of the budget more robust funding and stronger reporting requirements for no-cost calls, only providing $10 million for implementation, below the $35 million from the governor and the House in their budgets. And they did not include stronger reporting language that the Senate had wanted. The final budget also left out an important voting reform that would have delinked the municipal census from voter registration, something that Massachusetts is the only state to do that there was no actual justification for doing, because we already can clean voter rolls through an interstate consortium that we're a part of. Okay, so that was all of my talking about things that happened. What didn't? So as you would have likely saw in a lot of the news coverage as the legislative session wrapped up, and they stayed into session until 10 a.m. on August 1st, they left a lot of work simply undone. That includes climate legislation, whether in both the Senate and the House passed bills to do siting reform, for siting energy, especially clean energy projects, with the Senate doing a more robust bill to help transition away from gas, even though both bills were severely lacking. It would be nice if, living in the hottest summer we've experienced to date, our legislature actually passed climate legislation. They, despite talking about actually taking the steward crisis seriously, did not come to agreement on hospital oversight bills that each chamber passed. They did not come to agreement on drug pricing bills that each chamber passed. They did not come to agreement on maternal health bills that each chamber passed. Substance abuse and recovery bills that both chamber passed, including, which on the Senate side included a pilot program for overdose prevention centers, an important form of harm reduction. They didn't come to agreement on economic development bills, which on the Senate side included important language to keep effectively high school seniors out of adult prisons. So one thing that we have seen kind of come up in discourse from the governor, from places like the Boston Globe, from you, is that the legislature should come back in session. Some of this, as what I noted before, the legislature could potentially pass without coming back in person. Given that with some of these bills, like their hospital oversight bill and the maternal health bill, and drug pricing bills were passed unanimously, they're able to pass that. Nobody was going to show up to object to passing them, and if they come to an agreement in the coming months, those can become law. You need to remind them that they should care about passing their own laws, but there's the economic development bill, and which should include important policies like raise the age, and much more important than tax credits for the biotech industry, can't be passed without coming back into session, because of any bond authorizations need a formal recorded vote. And especially climate legislation, because House and Senate Republicans have opposed any efforts of passing meaningful climate legislation. That cannot pass in an informal session. All that needs to happen is one Republican showing up to say no, and the bill is dead, without them being willing to come back and actually show up, finish their job, and vote for their own legislation. So, to take a break from me talking, wanted to provide an opportunity for people to take action and call or email your legislators to tell them that they should come back before the legislative session ends in January of next year in person to finish their job, particularly as it relates to passing kind of robust climate legislation, but also as it relates to the other issues that they did not finish. I will entertain a few questions, but then go off audio so that people can make calls. And I can also drop in, if you don't know your legislator's phone number, I can drop that into the chat. Susan.
Okay, you can hear me now?
Yes.
I find it confusing. There's two things, the housing bond bill and the Affordable Housing Act. And is that one thing or two things?
Same bill.
Okay, so the bond bill has the menu, but it also has some policy issues which do get passed.
Yes. So the issue, the policies are all law. They were passed, they were signed. What's the bond authorization? So that $5.16 billion, that's the menu of options, where not all $5.16 billion will get spent. Only about $2 billion will. But all of those policies have become law.
So it's one vote for those two things.
Yes, yeah. When the legislature passed that, there was one vote that contained all of those things, where the House had their version, the Senate had their version, and then they passed final versions of both.
How confusing.
Yes, the legislative process is not designed to be easy to follow. So yes, as well as been finding how they voted on things, also not designed to be easy to follow.
Thanks.
No problem. I see a question from Karen and a question from Casey, and then I will give a brief pause for people to contact their legislators. But Karen. You need to unmute.
Okay. Thank you. So it's a clarification question as follow-up to the housing bills that were passed. Do ADU regulations include any language restricting their use as Airbnbs?
I believe that the legislation that allows for municipalities to do that. There's language in that I think says that, like, I can pass along the exact wording, but in the legislation text itself, it does acknowledge that it does not supersede any local regulations limiting their use for short-term rentals.
Thank you.
Good question. Casey.
Yeah, one of the questions I have, because throughout the night you guys were working, I was up also doing the same. Usually I'll come in person, but that's not good. I did reach out to, because I do walk across. I did reach out to some of the Republican that I know that are very, very open. And good news is one of the ones that gave you guys difficulty changed his mind. But I was still wondering, did any of these ones that they left out? I can't believe they left out the important bills, climate bills, raise the age. I mean, that's just crazy. Is any of these ones, did they send it back to study or under consideration? Because I can't stand that stuff. If you say study, it means forget it. You might as well go back in January.
Yeah, so I'll get to those. So the things that I've talked about so far are things that have either passed or are in conference committee, a conference committee being 3 senators and 3 representatives negotiating final language. I have additional slides that talk to what you noted about things that have been sent to study, or just kind of somehow dispensed, or just like still stuck for the legislative session. So I have additional slides that touch on that momentarily.
All right, that sounds good. So if you provide me the names of the senators that are working on these ones now, I will reach them. I could tell you that after the 31st July, they all gone somewhere.
Yeah,
you can't
exactly.
reach them. You're gonna have to go in person unless you know them personally. You're not gonna reach them.
Yeah, no, exactly. That they go on vacation. That I will drop in. I'll send us follow-up for this event information about the specific conference committees in question, especially so if you happen to know the legislators involved. To quickly acknowledge a few things in the chat before then pausing to allow people to contact legislators. Regarding the questions about eviction sealing, it should be automatic. It is not. They all require a petition. However, it is for cases of eviction by non-payment, kind of non-payment evictions. People would be able to have their eviction records sealed after 4 years, provided that there are no other such evictions in that period. And for cases of fault evictions or kind of quote unquote nuisance evictions, 7 years. And then after that, again, it's sealed. It's banned from credit reports, etc.
That's why we love you, Jonathan. Thank you.
No, happy to help. Just see one question in the chat when it comes to some of the descriptions of bills. I can pop into the chat a few different things that we have on our website that do talk about those. I will, while pausing from my talking, to drop in a contact your reshare my sample script and drop in legislative contact information. I can drop in a few links as well so that people can make a phone call or send an email to your legislators to encourage them to come back into session to finish their work, especially to pass climate legislation. I see a great question from Norma. You don't, about if your legislator is the Senate president, urge her to come back and urge her to bring them back into session and urge her to fight for strong climate legislation that includes and builds on what the Senate did rather than caving into the House's more narrow bill, is what I would say. The Senate bill, and I think something important to stress when it comes to climate legislation, is the Senate bill actually included measures to transition Massachusetts away from gas, which the House largely ignored. And I think that's, both of the bills could be stronger on environmental justice, but that's one thing that the Senate did, and the Senate should fight to protect. I can also drop into the chat. I'll drop into the chat. Let me reshare my screen and then drop in a few things into the chat. Okay. So I'll copy this script into the chat. I will take myself off video for a few while I put together a collection of links and let you make a few phone calls and then regroup in about 3 minutes. Okay. Okay, welcome back. I am going to quickly, before resharing my screen, I'm going to drop into the chat some links I had promised to share. I have a write-up on our website of the Senate's climate bill and one component of the economic development bill. I can provide additional write-ups of some of the other things discussed later. And we'll provide some of the more in-depth write-ups that I have of some bills we talked about in an email follow-up when I send you a bunch of links in the video recording. I hope people had enjoyable calls with their leaving answering machine messages or text messages or emails. The benefit, if you are an introvert and you want to call your legislators, do it after 5 p.m. Nobody will be there, but your call still matters. But to just highlight a few quick more things on this, let me share my screen and get back to the proper. Okay. To continue on for a little bit more, I think it's only about 15 minutes or so more, and then I will free you to your evening. Okay. We talked about what had passed, what still might pass, but is stuck. And I wanted to talk a little bit about some things that passed in one chamber and not in another, or got stuck in committee or in other ways. For example, several of the bills that the Senate has passed this session have gone nowhere in the House. The Senate, as they have done on multiple occasions in past sessions, passed a bill called the Healthy Youth Act, which is requiring school districts that teach sex ed to teach sex ed that is LGBTQ inclusive, comprehensive, medically accurate, consent informed, should not be controversial, and yet the Massachusetts House has refused to take it up. The Senate passed language to codify the existence, kind of the option of a non-binary designation on state-issued IDs, as well as to make it easier for unhoused individuals to access state IDs. We've seen in recent days Republicans try to attack Governor Tim Walz of Minnesota, the Democratic VP nominee, for legislation that Minnesota Dems passed to make menstrual products available in schools. Legislation from the Senate to do this, and kind of those in other public facilities, has faced pushback from the House for unclear reasons. And the Senate had also passed a kind of broad-ranging bill on plastics reduction that did things like kind of have kind of like a plastic bag ban, a program for recycling large plastic items like car seats, and a number of other steps. The Senate put a lot of work into it. The House has refused to take it up. That means likely for any of these that they go right back to square one at the start of the next legislative session. Things that are stalled in the Ways and Means Committee. As a form of just vocabulary, the Ways and Means Committee is the budget writing committee in the Massachusetts State House. Any legislation that potentially touches money goes through the Ways and Means Committee, so it's typically the last committee before a bill gets to the floor. If a bill has gotten to Ways and Means, what that implies is that the first committee working on the bill already gave it a stamp of approval and sent it out, but that it has not made it to the floor. Such things include permanent hybrid meeting access, facial surveillance regulations, banning the sale of cell phone location data, putting a moratorium on new prison and jail construction, something that the legislature passed 2 years ago, but did not bring up to the floor this session. Strengthening language, access, and inclusion in state government, disentangling state and local law enforcement from ICE, something that many people here have been fighting on for about a decade already, if not longer. Expanding opportunities for judicial diversion for youth, strengthening protections for visitation rights, addressing indoor air quality in environmental justice communities, halting new gas infrastructure expansion, the Sunlight Act, which expands public records law to cover the governor and legislature, and kind of a constitutional amendment that did get out of committee about restoring voting rights for individuals currently serving felony convictions. So all of these things actually did get out of a committee, but then got stalled thereafter. And what that's likely to mean, because the legislature is not likely to take them up, they should. You should still, if you're you can still ask your legislator, they should still hear from you, but these likely will all have to start from square one, which is a terrible legislative process. Some things that we care about never made it out of committee in the first place. That's what was noted before about when bills get sent to study, a polite way of defeating bills, or in one case, discharged with no recommendation at all. Things like ending state takeover of school districts and ending the overuse of high stakes testing, the latter of which continues on as a ballot question, question 2. Comprehensive higher ed reform, as in the bill called the Cherish Act, Medicare for all, shout out to Kimberly Connors from MassCare, who I saw on here earlier, establishing a public bank, different local options for expanding democracy, like allowing 16 and 17-year-olds to vote, allowing kind of legally, like kind of all legal residents to vote, allowing cities and towns to adopt ranked choice voting, things like same-day registration, again, like voting rights restoration, making large polluters pay for the cost of climate resilience, or ending the sentence of life without parole. All of these things that many of you fought for got stuck in committee because of our legislature not wanting to use their large Democratic supermajority for action, and all have to start again in the new legislative session. Some bills are still in committee, but unlikely to see action. That includes raising the minimum wage to $20 per hour, or extending collective bargaining rights to state house staff. If a bill gets an extension, as these did until December 31st, that effectively means that the legislature intends to do nothing, because they aren't going to be actively doing work for the rest of the year. So all of those are fights that will continue. It would be nice if our Democratic trifecta, as we've seen in states like Minnesota and Michigan, tried using it for bold policy making. Would that it be otherwise? Okay, I promised that one more possible action to pause before then a final set of Q&A. So I want to, if Carolyn Shu, are you still on here?
Yes, I'm here.
Okay, I will I'll spotlight you to share one additional action that people can take this evening.
Perfect. Hi everyone, good to see folks. I'm Carolyn. I'm the director at Homes for All Massachusetts, and a Boston resident. So we've been working on issues like rent control and foreclosure mediation as immediate solutions to support tenants and low-income homeowners across the state. But we know, right, that many of our community members actually don't even have housing to be evicted from, and had to rely on the shelter system. We know that our family shelter system was broken for many years, that the average stay was over a year before this recent wave of migrants and other folks coming into the system. And now we're very concerned with the new guidance that folks may have seen. So we're kind of stepping in alongside Mass Coalition for the Homeless and Mass Law Reform Institute, who have been really holding down the family shelter work for many years. But we feel like it's a core part, right, of the work of housing our most vulnerable folks, housing working class communities, housing low income communities, housing Black and Brown communities. So, and we think we have a fundamental threat to our shelter system right now, right? We have been a right to shelter state for 40 years. And we think both the governor and the legislature are slowly chipping away at that through these different policies around the overflow shelters that we've seen over the last period. And this has really come to a head recently. So I think folks probably saw like a month ago, they said folks were not allowed to sleep in Logan Airport anymore, which is where people were sleeping if they could not get into the overflow sites. And we thought that was going to create a wave of people, but there was enough beds and they shuffled things around. And now, though, we are facing a really serious crisis because the governor made a announcement with no heads up to anyone that that now the overflow system will change, and you either can choose 5 days at, now they're going to call the overflow sites respite sites, so 5 nights at a respite site, and then you cannot enter the list to get a shelter bed for 6 months, or you can put your name on the list, but then just wait for a shelter bed. And you know, when we're talking both about new migrants coming to Massachusetts and longtime residents, the exceptions include things like folks who have no fault evictions. But as folks are asking about with the eviction ceiling, we know there are many people who have non-payment evictions or fault evictions who still need to house their children and families. And so even this like guidance that's supposed to be centering Massachusetts residents it's not, right? But ultimately what we think is that there's been all this push that we need to bring more folks to Massachusetts. There's all this need for people to work and live here and spend their money here. And, you know, was an ad campaign in Florida for LGBTQ folks to move here. And yet there are tons of folks coming here because we are the hub of the Haitian community. And there are also just folks who've lived in Massachusetts, maybe for a year or two, maybe for 50, who are, you know, also swept up in this really challenging system. So I put in the chat, but we're doing another action. This 5-day guidance did go into effect. We're seeing, I'm on some text threads just and we're seeing like, I think tonight Beyond, the Boston Immigrant Justice Accompaniment Network, put up 30 families in hotels. I mean, folks have the new migrants who are coming here. Most folks I have met, they have 1-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 5-year-olds. Folks are not coming here because they heard Massachusetts was a right to shelter state. People are coming here because they have no options, because we are a cultural center of a community. And instead of celebrating that, the state is trying to tell people that they are not welcome here. And so, yeah, we think it's a threat to both long-term residents and our right to shelter, as well as, you know, our orientation toward new arrivals coming into our state. So we're going to do another action this week. This will be a candlelight vigil at the State House on Wednesday. And we're continuing to just do more and more actions to try to really get some pressure out. I think we got good media last week, and we're going to keep pushing. So there'll be more to come, but that's the next action. And just, you know, unlike some other things, I do feel like this can change, because this is just made up guidance that they have now created. And so with political pressure, they can undo it. This is not a law. This is simply just a FAQ guidance, and we can change that. So we really want to keep the pressure up, again, both for recent immigrant folks who are coming here in dire situations, and for long-term residents who need the shelter system, who also need the shelter system to not be dismantled.
Awesome. Thank you, Carolyn. And I want to drop into the chat quickly, if people would like to send an email to the governor, I dropped in the email the governor's office link. So while I share my last formal content slide, take a moment to email Governor Healy about why it's important to uphold the right to shelter. We should be proud to be a right to shelter state, not make that something to roll back. Like, people in the state elected a Democratic governor and a Democratic legislature, and they did not do that to get tax cuts for rich people and then end to right to shelter. Sort of bluntly. I'll give a shout out I saw in the chat. Have Jean Kempthorne share kind of an excellent report diagnosing problems with the legislature. One of my slides, any of these points could be a whole evening of their own, so maybe that's something for another time. Some of the problems at the root of some of the legislative inaction that we've talked about are the culture of procrastination that exists in the legislature, where we know the power of a deadline, but there should not be a reason for the legislature to wait until the very end. One thing that I think exacerbates this, as well as the fact that the legislature is designed to prevent any individual legislators from gaining institutional knowledge. So when they play musical chairs every new year with new committee assignments about issues about which they might know nothing, that makes it harder on us as activists to explain bills to legislators who then may have not actually spent any time with them in the past legislative session. They might still not in the new one, but it constantly changes who that first group of people that you need to even talk with are. We have an over-centralization of power structure in the legislature. And as people know from any facet of life, when too many decisions are centered in too few people, things slow down. Even if people have the best of intentions, I personally would not attribute perfect intentions to elected officials as a general rule. But even if people have the best of intentions, things slow down when they're too centralized, which shows for the need for kind of empowerment of more rank and file legislators, empowerment of committee chairs beyond just leadership to actually speed up a process. We also have a problem of the lack of competitive elections and a lack of felt urgency that legislators should need to feel a need to earn their keep constantly. That it's one thing that we can see in a number of other states, and I'll use Minnesota as the example that we've seen in the news recently because of Governor Tim Walz, where the Minnesota Democrats had a very productive legislative session. And it's because the Minnesota Democrats view power as fundamentally limited, and it's something that they had to fight to keep. I think we're lucky that we're not likely to ever see a kind of a conservative wave sweep and take over either the House or the Senate in Massachusetts. But we need a greater sense of urgency, and in some ways, primary elections can create the competitive elections in that regard can put more fire under the legislators. We also have kind of the way in which centralized power leads to outsized influence of well-funded industry lobbyists who often don't show up to those public hearings, but are ones that legislators give far too much weight to, particularly if they lack individual policy expertise themselves on issues. Any one of these could be their own event, possibly in the future. But rather than dive into that, wanted to go to it, just take to wrap up with some Q&A before wrapping up for the evening. And you will obviously hear more from us as we continue the additional months of this legislative session and the start of the next one. Jean.
Thank you, John. Fabulous presentation. I just would like to, on behalf of the Coalition to Reform Our Legislature, invite any of you activists or anyone that you know to prepare a narrative about your particular tale of woe. A project that didn't go anywhere, that should have, your interactions, etc. We want to compile those into an archive of narratives. And please do check out the website of, it's called Leg Reform. I didn't come up with the .org. It's pretty awful, but it explains some of the problems. I want to add to John's list 2 key issues. One is that there is no research function whatsoever, no fiscal analysis. The legislature is caught by surprise. Staffers are woefully undertrained. Legislators do not even really see their job as legislating, but rather doing the bidding of those leaders who control the purse strings. And that means the purse strings that pay them as much as 50% of their pay can be in the form of stipends. So it's a critical problem, and one we should all be very conscious of. What it really comes down to is that our legislators work not for us, but for the leadership. Thank you.
No, excellent point. It reminds me of a way that I often speak of the legislature suffering from a 2 bosses problem. That in most jobs, the person who can hire and fire you and the person who controls your pay are the same person. That's what you call your boss. But in the legislature, the people who can hire and fire you are your constituents, and the people who controls your pay are the speaker and the Senate president. And I'll give a shout out to Boston Globe has had some good recent pieces about the kind of hierarchical pay structure of the legislature that reinforces that. And if they never have contested elections ever, that means that the only boss that they ever really feel like they need to listen to is the one who controls their pay, which speaks to the need for more work, both in terms of advocacy and in terms of elections, to reassert the public boss that exists. we as constituents are. And Jean, if you have a kind of a story collection form, shoot me an email and I'll include it in my follow-up email to everybody who's been on this. And thank you for doing that. There are probably so many such stories. To see if we'll recognize one question in the chat about when legislators might come back into session. Not going to happen in August. If they do, because they all view themselves as being on vacation in the month of August, they're not likely to do anything as it gets close to the November election. It basically is likely to mean that either possibly they do something in September or they come back after the November election. We should not have to wait for them that long to do what is their job and to finish that, but that's the greatest likelihood of them coming back, probably in a period after the primary election and before the end of September. They likely would not do October because October starts getting into kind of election season again for the general election, as well as I would expect many legislators want to be able to go out of state if they don't face contested elections themselves before November. So it would then be sometime in November, if not then. But happy to take a few other questions before wrapping up. Questions go, and I will share the video if you joined late, or if you had to leave early and come back. I will be sharing the video as well as some of the links discussed that we have. Terry, I see a hand.
Do you know if there's templates for to call your state rep or email your state rep to get them back into session? Because that would be really nice to share that on social media or to friends.
I can share something when I do kind of a round of follow-up links to this email. I can send something that you can share.
And will that include the slides?
Yeah, I can include a link to the slide deck, links discussed, sample scripts, video. It'll be a long email, but it'll have everything that I promised this evening.
That sounds great. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you. Any final questions from people? Travis.
John, do you think there's like better, I don't know if you know like answer this, but do you think there's like more effective ways of responding to the legislature when it's not doing a good job? I'm just recounting earlier in the session when the tax break vote was going on and the vote in the legislature to cap shelters, there wasn't like a lot of public criticism while it was happening. Yeah, helpful with that.
Yeah, in terms of like how to prevent, like rather than like the case of when they're like not doing good things, when they're actively doing bad things. Some of that I think needs to be in media. Like the difficulties, I feel like that a lot of legislators are immune to public shame, which can make it difficult. Although I don't think that there was enough of that during then, whether that's in terms of getting that more into general large scale media narratives or in terms of letters to the editor and kind of editorials and like small stuff with local media. One thing that it talked about in a recent kind of meeting was the way that legislators sometimes do respond more to like postcards and physical mail than they do to emails, because they get so many emails and having forms of communication that are fundamentally different can stand out to them more as one possible thing. I think also would benefit from people just like showing up in person a lot more. I think I'm glad that we've now moved past the kind of COVID era of nothing ever happening in person. I think that could have happened more during the tax bill, of having people do kind of constituent meetings so that legislators have to face their constituents one-on-one about their disappointments with what they're doing. Also, I would say go to legislators' events when they're expected to be only showered with praise and add some criticism to them is probably also helpful in that regard. So there are many, I think, ongoing discussion, but many things to think about as we go into the next session to make sure that, by this session ends on a better note than it ended on July 31st, as well as to go into the next legislative session. I'm going to answer. I see the question from Kevin in the chat, and then I'll go to, I see kind of Matt, I see your hand up. Kevin, your question in the chat about the kind of the budget kind of overrides that the House had passed. I have to profess, I have not actively followed. I typically don't actively follow the line item veto overrides. They mainly seem like good things, but I don't know about the likelihood of the Senate taking them up. But I'm happy to look into that and include that in follow up. And then to go to Matt, your hand.
Yeah, Jonathan, on both the House and the Senate calendars, it says that there'll be a joint session on November 14th. I've been wondering if that's a date in which they basically want to have everything determined by, if that's kind of a deadline, or do you know what that could possibly be?
I think that that's a formality that they probably waive. That I don't think that there's any standing business that I know of for them for November 14th. They haven't announced anything. It might be something that exists on the calendar. Like one thing that can exist on the legislative calendar, although not being used, is that there are specific dates on the legislative calendar for constitutional conventions that they just don't hold. It's possible that it's something of that kind, because that's the rare times that they do joint sessions can be those. They just end up waiving them. But that they should take advantage of that being a day and do stuff on it. But it's not clear that it means anything. But I can ask. Any final questions? Can I get people to give a round of applause to yourself for being on a Zoom for an hour and a half on a summer evening to talk about the legislature? Okay. You will all get follow up soon. And I want to kind of part by thanking everybody here for joining this evening. This is, I'll kind of mark this the end of the formally recorded event. If folks want to stay on with any kind of lingering questions or other things, I'm happy to leave the Zoom open for a little bit